Here we are to chapter 12 of Tucket's Home by Gary Paulson. That's the last chapter, and then there's a little afterword. And so here we go. It turned out to be 3 days to where the settlements began. It was a quiet ride, for Francis hardly spoke, and it silenced Lottie. Francis was getting more and more anxious. Were his parents alive? How did his parents and his sister Rebecca look now? How would they feel when they saw him? They would have thought him dead all this time after all. What would they think of Lottie and Billy? If he expected to find them at once, he was to be sadly disappointed. At the first settlement, they had never heard of the name Tucket, nor at the second. And in the third, a man looked at them and said, "Tucket. Now that sounds familiar. Let me see." Lottie clutched Francis's arms. "I got it," the man said. "Weren't they all killed on the river?" After that, Francis nearly stopped looking, but Lottie got her stubborn streak up. "Francis," she said, you can't stop now. Billy and me won't let you stop." So they rode on, Lottie talking to fill the silence. 9 days later, in the fifth settlement, they stopped at a lean-to that served as a store and trading post. A wizened old man leaned across the board counter and said, "A family called Tucket? Would there be a girl named Rebecca?" "Yes." Francis held his breath. How long? How many months? All the time he had spent searching now came down to this very second. "Would she have black hair?" "She does." Is it the family that lost a boy lost to him to the Indians?" "Yes," Lottie shouted. Francis nodded. "Lost me. They lost me." "Ah," the old man nodded. "Then they must be the ones. Where are they? Where?" Lottie could stand it no longer. The old man looked at her, then at Francis. "Pushy little bit, ain't she?" "Please, sir," Francis said, "where are the Tuckets?" "The Tuckets!" Billy roared. The old man pointed to the twin rut road, that's two ruts in the road, right? That went west from the lean-to. 4 miles that way, then 1 mile off the road. They have a sign with their name on it. You can't miss it." But the three of them were already gone. Francis stopped his horse and sat quietly on her for a moment, watching the man in the field, letting the sight of him fill his heart. The man was plowing, working a team of horses, and he had his back to the three of them. Francis clucked to his horse and tightened his heels, and the pony moved forward, walking softly but slightly faster than the plow horses, until she was just 4 feet in the back of the man working the plow. Lottie and Billy followed him. Billy smiling, but Lottie oddly serious with a worried look. The man stopped and straightened his back and wiped sweat from his forehead and turned and saw what at first he took to be 3 Indians and a pack horse following them. I bet he did too. They were all dressed in buckskins, seasoned by hundreds of campfires and rain, their faces weather-blasted and burned and blackened. Francis wore his hair tied back in a club with a rawhide thong, and he held a rifle that had become part of him, an extension of his arm. "What? Who?" Francis let him wonder for another beat. Then he slid off the horse and he stood, taller than his father now, leaner, and he said, "Hello, Pa. How are you?" For a second, then two, there was nothing. Then a look, a swift flash in the man's eyes. "Francis?" A smile from deep inside and a bellow, "Francis!" And he reached over and he jerked Francis away from the horse, was holding him and crying and hugging all at once. And Francis was home. Wow. Well, now comes the afterword. Here we go. That's what it's called. See, it says afterword. After Francis returned, his family was, of course, ecstatic. At first, his mother almost could not accept it. Many times, months after he was home, she would come to his bed while he was sleeping and push his hair back from his head, kiss him on the forehead, touch his cheek. At first, it bothered him. At first, many things bothered him. Sleeping in the cabin his father had made was hard, since he was accustomed to sleeping outside, and having people around him all the time was hard too, and the noise of the farm. But after a time, he came to like the closeness, the hard work, the wonderful food made of so many things besides meat. The wonderful food made by his mother and Rebecca. Remember, he thought she was dead. He liked farming, working alongside his father, the way his father said son, and liked going for walks with Rebecca and how she made him laugh. He liked the way Rebecca, Lottie, and Billy became good friends. Lottie and Billy stayed briefly with the Tuckets, then were taken in by another family who had lost their children to cholera on the way across. They lived just over a hill and saw the Tuckets nearly every day. After they all got settled, there was the question of the Spanish treasure. Francis and Lottie and Billy were almost staggeringly rich, for they had 75 pounds of gold and 60 pounds of silver among the three of them. The gold alone was so valuable that the same amount would have made them multimillionaires in modern times. It's hard to get exact ratios, but it must be remembered that the main reason the Oregon Trail existed and that such a huge percentage of the population went west, the largest mass migration in American history, was that hundreds of banks were failing and the country was in severe depression. People had lost farms, houses, land. Nearly everybody was dirt poor, literally. And this poverty was most extreme in the New West. Everything was done by barter or trade. Money in the form of currency hardly existed, and anybody who had money or gold or silver was in a very good position to make more. At the tender age of 11, Lottie became something of a banker. When Francis was glad to leave, and Francis was glad to leave her in charge. Billy was too. Once he'd bought and eaten his fill of rock candy, the money didn't interest Billy. So Lottie loaned the money at interest, investing and reinvesting, so that in 3 short years she had nearly doubled the amount they'd found in the Spanish grave. Through defaults and loans, she acquired 2 farms and a sawmill, which she leased back to the previous owners and continued to earn money on. Meanwhile, Francis worked with his father on the farm. For a time, he was content with the work, and life as it was. Then there came a day when he went to see Lottie about something financial, and he wasn't sure why, but on the way he stopped and picked some wildflowers and handed them to her when he arrived. And she nodded and smiled in a soft new way and put them in a jar with water. The next day, he brought flowers again. She smiled. And so gradually, Francis and Lottie changed the way they thought about each other. Almost 1 year later to the day they wed, the day after the marriage, Billy ran off to sea. I want to see more of the world, he said. I'll be back. And he did come back. But in the meantime, Francis and Lottie set up housekeeping on a farm down the road. 4 years later, Billy returned. The three of them now owned many farms and several large herds of brood mares and horses, a wagon factory, 4 sawmills, 3 small hotels. Billy took some of his money and bought a square-rigged sailing ship and started a shipping line. Within 5 years, he had 3 more ships and was hauling wood cut by his own sawmills to China to trade for tea and porcelain, which he shipped east to Europe, and then brought people back from Europe to the East Coast before starting the circle again. When he could, Billy returned home. He also married and had children, and Lottie and Francis had children, and in turn married and had children, and each of the states of Oregon and Washington are owned by their children, or much of the states of Oregon and Washington are owned by their children and their children's children and their children. Francis lived to be an old man and died in 1923. Lottie lived 7 years longer. They never traveled again. They lived their lives in a small frame house just over the hill from the original Tucket homestead, amassing one of the great American fortunes. Each evening after supper, Francis would take his rifle and go sit among the trees as the sun went down and think of prairies and storms and Indians and mountain men and herds of buffalo and grizzlies and horizons. Oh yes, horizons. And every night, the last thought before he went back to the house to drink a cup of warm tea and to sleep, every night he'd think the same thought of a one-armed mountain man leaning back against a tree dead. Every night his last thought was of Jason Grimes. Well, there you go, my friends. That's the end of the book. There's actually an author's note, and I didn't quite get that excited about the author's note. So I just ended right there with the afterword. There we go. That was the end of the whole Tucket series here on my YouTube channel. If you like it, let me know. And I'll be back to reading some other things. And somewhere down the future, I'll pick up another Gary Paulson book. Probably Hatchet or something like that. Until the next time, bye.